My name is Connor Kelly. I'm a junior consultant here at Turner& Townsend, and we're joined today by Louise, a consultant at Turner& Townsend, who will be leading the masterclass today on biodiversity in housing and retrofit. So this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner& Townsend. So now I'm going to hand over to Louise, who's going to lead the session today.
Thank you, Connor. Yeah, welcome everyone. This is a really important and also quite interesting topic to talk about. So looking to cover this from all different angles of a retrofit project today, and hopefully you can take away something that will help you with your next retrofit project. And before we get started, a reminder of, if you've not heard of it before, the Mobilisation Competence Assessment. So this is where RISE can offer one-to-one tailored support to help you with mobilisation. So moving on to biodiversity. We're going to be talking about kind of roughly what it is and what legislation applies in the UK. And then we're going to go into more detail about different types of considerations you can take for your project and some resources as well. So basically, if you're brand new here and not entirely sure what it is and where it all comes from, biodiversity, bio means living things and diversity is the variety of it. So we're looking at how this from habitat and ecological perspective, what can we consider for our retrofit projects? And there'll be a mixture of roles here, I imagine, maybe some sort of project managers or tenant liaison officers and or even asset teams, sustainability teams. But there are also specific roles out there more on this nature side of things, and hopefully everyone can take something away. And why is this important? So everything in our world really comes back to biodiversity of some kind, some sort of living thing. It can help fuel our diets, our food, also animals, medicine, energy, habitats for animals, and a stable climate. So you can see in the middle here, this is the 10-year global risks ranked by severity, and you can see the green ones are linked to the environment in some way. So the top four there all linked to the environment. You can see biodiversity loss is coming in at number 2 as a 10-year risk. And you can also see on the right here, so in the last 50 years, since 1970 to 2020, the monitored population of wildlife shrank on average by 73%. And then this did vary for different sort of areas of wildlife. So freshwater populations being hit the hardest with 85%, and marine at 56%, and terrestrial at 69%. So we think of things like the Great Barrier Coral Reef, and we think of the Amazon rainforest. But actually, and there used to be these windscreen bug tests and things like that. But actually, thinking about this, there's so many things in the UK that where birds are on endangered lists. And if you've ever watched David Attenborough documentaries and things, animals tend to be impacted by climate change and are fighting for more and more resource, and there's more competition for space. And it's generally just, obviously, I think we all know because you're here today that it is a very important topic, but we'll move on to really what we can do about it and what is being done about this. So biodiversity net gain, if you've not heard of that before, is a piece of policy legislation that does apply in England. So it comes under the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. And this particular bit, it's the Environment Act 2021 has been inserted into that. Essentially, this creates a requirement for 10% net gain for the qualifying developments. And the whole intention and aim of this is to make sure there's a better biodiversity outcome than what was there before. And this is in recognition of what we've just discussed on the previous slide and what is happening globally. So we need to do something about it. The overall kind of point from here would be to check if your development does qualify for these. They go onto the government UK website, and it goes through different types of developments, what to do if you're applying for planning permission, if this is a requirement, and different scales of projects, and that can advise you on that. And then whether you want to do it even as just an additional measure is also a consideration. You know, even if your project doesn't qualify as mandatory, you might still want to do this. So the overall approach that we can take here is minimizing the damage that you might cause, repairing the damage that you do cause, and then thinking about that net gain aspect. What can you additionally add to this? So this is kind of the whole principle and approach that I'll be applying to this presentation. And I've put some examples here. You know, if it's heat pump, thinking about how can you repair any damage that you are going to cause. You know, plants might not be able to be too near that air source heat pump, if you're putting scaffolding up and it's going to go over like a hedge or damage some plants or bedding, and it might be unavoidable because maybe it has to go there, how can you then repair this? And also thinking about disruption of sort of nests, we'll get into that as well. And the net gain bit being going above and beyond. So again, thinking about the approach, what is the kind of process? I think when we talk about topics, we go from what is the theory, what is the policy, what is the sort of process, what is the journey you can take, and then we'll get into some specific examples. So we're thinking here about what is the actual scope of your project. So how many homes you're doing, where are they, what are the measures that you're doing, and what is the actual impact? And then you can look at what the existing biodiversity scene is like in that area. So understanding, is there anything local to your area that is of interest? You can try and check with planning teams or anything local. So are birds currently nesting there? Have you currently got specific trees there that are particularly native? What is the current scene? And then what is going to be the expected impact of your project? If you are doing EWI, putting scaffolding up, you're changing the whole surface of the facade, you're causing noise and disruption. So whether that's going to be over sort of bird nesting periods and you're going to have sort of noisy machinery and things. And then how can you minimize any impacts that you might be causing, mitigate or mediate for ones that you have caused, and then what else can you do? If you're going out to these properties and you're going to be out there doing your project, that's a chance for you to deliver this, deliver some positive impacts at the same time. So yeah, we talked about this briefly on the last slide, but what is the size of the project? So you should already, this should be information that you already have, either from a funding point of view, senior management point of view, financial, maybe it's for your carbon profiling, but you kind of know what maybe what measures you're doing, how many homes it may be. This is the type of information that then start to impact. So as an air source heat pump, start to think about, well, is that more or less disruptive, or I might not need scaffolding depending on where it is. If you're doing cavity wall insulation, maybe you see that as quite a low impact in terms of disruption to wildlife. Kind of might see that as a lower impact rather than a whole project, for example. And then the costs, I think early doors when you start to plan your project, it's really important to start to factor in cost and resource. So am I going to need surveys? If it's going through planning permission, then it might also meet any biodiversity net gain targets and what are going to be the additional resources for this, or just checking in general whether it qualifies for biodiversity net gain targets. How I'm going to have to check this. I'm going to have to properly put in the right resource and time. And then are you then going to talk about net gain? You might want to put in some budget. So if you're doing the SHF projects, you might have co-funding, you might have just your own sort of capital project funds are different. If you're in a council or a housing provider, you might have some funds that people want to use, and can you then buy additional measures, planting, sort of animal, sort of shelter habitats, and will the project then take more time and resource? So factor this in, make sure that you can still meet any mandatory milestones of the project. So we've got some examples of some measures that you might have in your project and what you might want to consider. So EWI, loft insulation or PV. Animals could be nesting in little crevices and cracks in the loft, and thinking about things like swifts, swallows, house martin birds. They might all go under the eaves and things like that, or even bats. They can go in and out of really small spaces, and whether you're taking away, particularly with EWI, if you're sort of resurfacing a whole facade, and quite a lot of the PAS requirements are that everything's really airtight, really then, and you might be monitoring air changes, you're taking away all these little cracks and sealing it all up so that it's really airtight, and maybe you're adding in some sort of separate ventilation, thinking about what that might disrupt. And if you are changing any overhangs or guttering and things, thinking about an overhang might be a bit for shelter and shade for any animals. And birds might have sheltering spots. There could be a lot of competition over the certain spots. Swifts and things only will be there at certain times of the year due to migration patterns. So thinking about what can I consider as this project. PV as well. It's quite common now to get sort of mesh netting gone alongside rooftop PV to stop sort of nesting underneath and things. There can be issues with bird feces in terms of if it does go over a solar panel, the solar panel can then but not be as effective and things like that. But it's thinking about this in your risk assessment and long-term ongoing maintenance as well. We've got this diagram on the right here, just as a sort of really quite a conceptual illustrative sort of consideration here. This is, you need street lighting, and I think there can be a motive to think, well, I just need to put any street lighting in, but actually, and you might think, oh, what does it really matter that I need to put that in? Does it really make a difference? Actually, yes, something so small and so simple, such as just the shade and the direction of the light. That's such a small thing, something that you've got control over, something that you can easily plan into the project. And if it doesn't make a difference to other parts of the project, if that still is safe for people to walk or go through at night and things like that, but actually you can minimize any light pollution for animals. That could be something that's really in your direct control you can think about. So just an example here of how you can take this as a sort of concept and think about that for, well, actually, what else can I do in my project that is really controllable? It's sort of small change, but big impact. So the retrofit areas, thinking about sort of bricks and nesting and any sort of plants. Again, go back to the air tightness. Air tightness is something that we usually really promote for retrofit because it can help sort of the insulation part, but then you need to have the air changeovers for the safety of everyone inside. But thinking about how can that then impact any animals that might be using that building. Green walls as well. So a green wall, obviously some people will have different thoughts about these. There's nothing to say that you're actually just planting trees and plants themselves. It doesn't have to be a green wall. If the amount of plants that you'd have on either or is the same, does it have to be a green wall? But I suppose a green wall can also provide an extra layer of insulation. It actually can maybe help with overheating in the summer because plants tend to have that evapotranspiration mechanism where there can be the cooling, so bringing that air in and out and helping that cooling facade as well. And then wildlife corridors. So this is potentially a little bit more for your more infrastructure, large scale developments, but thinking about, if you were building, for example, if you're building a road, you need to think about how animals can get through. But it's something to consider thinking about if you're doing a large scale retrofit, that might be a consideration for you as well. And obviously it would be for new builds. And today it's quite a big topic. We will be going into a few specific areas, so birds, plants, and small mammals. So we'll try to cover these in the session. Funding, as we're talking about all of this, it's really important to realise that a lot of what we're talking about, sometimes it's just a decision like the lights one, maybe that doesn't require extra funding, but a lot of this could require resource and funding. So it's important to think about it. It's about factoring in the same that you do for sort of planning permission. How can you factor this into your project? If any surveys are needed, ecological surveys or bat surveys, and how can you then seek additional external funding, for example, or can you develop a business case to get internal buy-in for this? And does it link up to any social value funds that you might have in place? Or do you have a sort of biodiversity funding pot? Is that something that your organisation has? Potentially not yet, but is it something you want to think about? So now we'll move on to specific areas. So birds. I did speak earlier that we think of biodiversity, the loss of wildlife or the threat to wildlife maybe being things like the Amazon rainforest, but actually in the UK they do sort of a survey every few years, and there's 70 species of birds on the red category list. And this has almost doubled since 1996. So I think, change is happening, and some of the examples of birds that we'll see on the red list are ones that maybe you wouldn't expect. Let me double check here, but I think, examples on the red list are starlings, swifts, and house martins. I think we tend to think of these as really common, but just shows you that they are under threat. But there are over 640 species of birds in the UK, and to say that 70 of them are on the endangered list, is not great. But obviously, let's talk about what we can do about this then. So the policy, there is the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the Wild Birds Directive, which you can read up on as well and look into where surveys might be needed. Some considerations for a retrofit project can be, so let's say insulation or different measures, thinking about where the local nesting spots might be. Can you then look into which birds might migrate at different times of the year? Thinking about the shelter, any disruption from sort of noise of works, and also having, so you can get little kind of nesting huts or little bird hut things, and actually it can be good to get quite a few of them so that birds aren't always competing over the same bits. And maybe you can check what's suitable for your area, but usually something like under eaves of a building can be quite good because it can be a bit of shade and a bit of shelter, and you might find that that's typically where birds sometimes are able to make their own nests at times. So that's something to consider as well. And thinking about how you can maybe minimize noise or disruption, even if you're going out from a net gain perspective, how are they going to feed? And also, so if you think some cavity wall measures might not need scaffolding, they may be just done from drilling in certain holes and then going from there. But EWI is going to be a more disruptive process. And then something like solar panels, maybe solar panels, especially if they're on the roof and not going under, the birds might be under the eaves, so it might be considered separate. But I think just a risk assessment about ongoing maintenance and how you're going to clean them, because a lot of solar panels now are installed with sort of anti-nesting mechanisms to prevent any mess. Then I'm going to move on to swifts. So this is just an example because they are on the red list, but they're also quite a common bird to see at the same time. It's just to show that their population is changing. So there's about 60,000 pairs in the UK, but this is actually a minus 66% reduction since from 1995 to 2022. So it's quite a large reduction there. And why is that important? So, swifts on their own, it's linked to so many other things. They can eat up to 20,000 insects a day, and those insects then can act as sort of natural pesticide for other sort of crops and food chains, and it can impact onto other birds and species and plants and crops. So it's thinking about this isn't actually just about this specific bird, it's really linked to so many things. And so they're usually in the UK they should be here just now, around April to August. So they are, compared to a lot of other birds, you can see other birds might be nesting elsewhere, but a swift typically does need a building to nest. So there are a lot of buildings in the UK, but they also will eat sort of flying insects, and spiders, having a lifespan of 9 years. So thinking about, what can you consider? There are things like swift bricks, you might have heard of those. You can also see examples where sometimes they will paint a little silhouette of a swift onto like a brick next to the swift brick to sort of act as a visual enticement and motivation, or basically just to signal to them that you're over here, almost like when you go to the toilet and you see which one am I meant to go to. A little picture of a swift on a building can help with that. And minimizing disruption. So again, yes, you can play swift noises to attract them, yep. And you can install multiple birdhouses. So go back to consider the shade and the shelter, and we'll move on to this one now. There's the example I was talking about with silhouettes painted onto the side of a building, and you can get swift bricks, and that could be something you could consider. And you can see on the bottom there's little paired nesting spots. So in this diagram in the middle kind of shows some considerations about, do you want to be near a tree but far away enough from other birds? What kind of height do you want to at? So all these different considerations, but ultimately it's shade, shelter, multiple options so that there's not too much competition from other birds, and visual cues. So I think in particular with the visual cues, if you say, for example, you're doing EWI, that building is going to change quite a lot in terms of the appearance. A visual cue might just be that additional bit that you can do. Bats. So there are 18 species of bats in the UK. There are lots of protections in place. It's quite a serious one. You should check whether surveys are needed. Then there can be a lot of strict rules around this. So please do take time to consider this in your project. But again, going back to how you consider certain aspects of this would be minimizing any disruption and thinking about shelter. And if there are 18 different species, you can look into in your local area, is there specific species that are more like got a higher population than others? So that's something to consider as well. So a single bat can eat up to 1,000 insects an hour. So going back again to this provides it's your food chain crop. If we lose lots of bats, birds, then the amount of insects that we would have that are going kind of uneaten in the food chain would really increase. Light pollution is really particularly important to bats. They are nocturnal, and thinking about any light pollution that you might have would be really, really important. And yeah, they typically do roost in a sort of sheltered space, whether that's a building or a cave, trees, etc. Like they do shelter. They can live up to 40 years. And I think there was also a stat that they can only have one baby a year. But anyway, things like that can be quite interesting just to sort of understand them a bit more, really. The more you understand what you're working with, you can then tailor things more sort of specifically. So retrofit considerations here, really, like I said earlier on, there's really strict, and rightly so, regulations about bats. Do check as to what surveys are needed. Think about the light pollution, shade and shelter, and how can you minimise any disruption. Again, same as birds, they can go into such tiny little spaces. So if you're making facades airtight and getting rid of lots of little cracks in a building, that can have a big impact. Small mammals, this is where we maybe like hedgehogs, badgers, or field martins, like little small squirrels and things like that, like very small ones are something to consider. Red squirrels are particularly endangered as well. So there's about five and seven that were analysed are experiencing long-term distribution reduction. So they probably see that there's now quite a lot of effort on sort of breeding and rewilding and making sure that the certain ones are not going to go extinct. But this is something, how can you consider this in your project? So the Protection of Badgers Act. There's also several bits of legislation out there, the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the Conservation of Habitat and Species Regulation. So this, it might seem a bit overwhelming as to how many things have I got to consider for my project, but again, it's just going to have so many benefits to you in the long run if you can consider these things now while you're doing the project. It's a really good time to get involved in it all rather than having to then think and do a separate project trying to mitigate for this project later on. You want to try get it in the one. Thinking about sort of local nesting spots, you'll know with hedgehogs and things, we tend to say in like bonfire night, you tell everyone to sort of check because hedgehogs like big piles of wood, things like that. Even just thinking about debris, even if you're just discarding a big pile of empty, like leftover materials from a retrofit project, I'd actually probably say that if you're just putting them like straight onto grass or something and not in a skip, thinking about, well, what little small mammals are going to try take shelter in there and they'll take cover. Well, they might just go in there thinking that it's a nice little spot. What if they then sort of get nest and get all settled and then you go and pick it up for going to dump, and thinking about things like this as well. Really, that could be any animal that could do that, but small mammals might be more prone to it. So thinking about any shelter disruption, and this more for the outside of the building, I would say, for a small mammal. I suppose technically like things like mice and rats probably count as small mammals, but we'll move on to this page now. Yep, so some small mammals can eat up to 90% of their body weight. I mean, I can believe that, I think. And then we've got an estimated 3.3 million small mammals in the UK. So thinking about which ones might be sort of seasonal and where they sort of might hibernate to, or any sort of dark and light impacts. Thinking about, am I going to be working the spring, the summer, the autumn, and are they going to hide in sort of big stacks of debris that I might have? So wildlife corridors, things considering hedgehogs, hedgehog houses, and I'm going to show you a little bit more in this next slide. So you can see here, thinking about crossings, connecting and stepping stones. So this might be for sort of larger scale project at times, and I'm pretty sure that bottom one, I think the hedgehog can go kind of down this little tunnel. So if you're building, a bridge or a project where an animal would normally the animal would be able to go from A to B, but then your interaction disrupts that and disrupts their pattern, and they now can't go from A to B. So you need to find an alternative to help them go from A along C and then back to B. Thinking about, what if that animal's actually needing to go there to get their food, or that's where they normally nest and breed or have their babies every year. If you're going to install something that disrupts that, then they should really consider things that you can do to, well, ideally avoid it in the first place. If you can, I think that's probably the first point of call. But yeah, larger mammals here, so this can consider things like badgers and things. I think squirrels are a lot more agile and can kind of climb around and do their own thing a little bit, but thinking about the ones that are particularly ground bound, if that's a term, but yeah, like the ones that kind of can't jump around and fly, how are they going to get from A to B? And then we have consideration of plants, benefits of plants. So plants, going back to kind of, I suppose, GCSE biology and things here, but the evapotranspiration is so important in terms of thinking reducing flooding, air quality, and things like that. But the whole process of that transpiration through the plant means that you're not going to have you can rise up and cool, and then this means that when you've got rain and things like that, it's going to sink into the soil a bit more. But if you get rid of all the plants and it's just tarmac and things, all that water has got nowhere to go. It's just going to come flying off tarmac, run down, follow gravity to the nearest point, and gravity will take it and wherever flooding may occur. So plants have that huge important aspect there of the reducing flooding, really, but also that can help animals. So shade, for example, this lots of birds and things will take shade, sheep, cattle and things in the summer. And, I personally think it's quite cruel if you put animals in a field with no shade, because if they're in the wild, they can go and find their own shade. They can go search for their own shade, just like if you're a human being, you want to go find shade if it's too hot. And obviously all this shade can then have a really good cooling effect. So you may have seen, I think we've got it on the next slide, but the pictures of cities where they show streets that they planted a lot of trees in, and the temperature change that has. So air quality as well, they are going to absorb the carbon dioxide and expel the oxygen. So a collective level, when you see things like wildfires, for example, or when you cut a tree, that all that carbon dioxide that was stored up and it was stored in that plant or tree, when it's cut or goes on fire, it goes back back out. So that benefit that you had is kind of lost. Social well-being is obviously pleasing. There's lots of studies that show things like, walking in nature for 10 minutes a day can have such a important impact on your well-being, or even just having a plant in the house or plant in the office. It's good for us, but we are probably not made to just work or live in conditions where we don't see light and stars and trees, plants and animals. Like we need to see that. Water absorption, so it helps animals, and the cooling effect as well. So that evapotranspiration, that kind of cycle, it goes up, the hot air rises, and when it cools, come back down, that cooling effect, and that can help create cooling in sort of cities and things like that as well, if you've got lots of trees. So food, what have I got here? Food for the herbivores and omnivores. Yep, so yeah, cattle, cattle, sheep, things like that. They will use that for the diet. Crops, even just like wheat, things like that. We rely on it, but also animals too. And the soil quality. So the more roots in the plants that you've got, that kind of binds the soil together, and it makes it sort of more stable. So that when you do get like a really heavy downpour, like just now we've had really, really dry spring, you'll tend to find that heavy downpour, if that heavy downpour comes down, it's going to, say that heavy downpour comes down a forest in Scotland. If there's so much vegetation, it'll be absorbed and it'll go really well. But if it comes onto like a really tarmacked area, there's just nowhere for it to go, and it's just going to, or on a not tarmacked area, just some soil with no plants. The roots and the stability of that soil is not as rich. It's not holding as much nutrients and good nitrogen as well, isn't it? But it's not holding as much sort of gases in it and CO2. There's nowhere for the water to go as much. And fundamentally, I think we've all got the gist on that one. But we've also got things like the picture there, the trees with trees without trees. That's an example that's used a lot. And sustainable urban drainage systems, so SUDs. And this is now, you're starting to see that more and more as being integrated into infrastructure projects. So it's really important and becoming more and more commonplace. And air quality as well. So I think you probably will notice a difference yourself, but air quality, is you need to have, I think having a few plants in your house or in an office, you can kind of start to notice the difference. And you can tie that into your air quality now as well, can be in your sort of climate or sustainability strategy, and you might have points in the city where you are monitoring air quality. So that could be something that, if you're starting to monitor air quality, particularly say you're in a big city like Southampton, they'll probably have air quality monitored at the port. And I don't know, let's say Manchester, Glasgow, they're, in my head, relatively similar in terms of quite a lot. If they've got motorways, that they might have an air quality bit. Glasgow M8 has like one with 8 lanes. You might have an air quality monitoring station there. So you might have points in the city where you are monitoring air quality, and then you can take this baseline and you can maybe start to do some funding and do some projects to plant lots of trees, maybe in a sort of, I don't know, like a ring around it, and then see whether that actually has any impact. But obviously there'll be lots of other reasons that have contributed to any changes. Plants. So there's also the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, and Act prevents intentional picking, uprooting, destruction, selling, possession, and transport. So there's also bits to consider here around things about talking about that in your project, talking to the planning team, thinking about any sort of trees that might be particularly protected, native, historic. How can you look into that as well? And if you are going to be doing any planting, can you make sure it's like a sort of something that's not going to be too invasive and local to the area? There's biodiversity one, and there's also climate resilience for housing.